A struggling mechanic helped a stranded woman fix her broken-down truck, only to later discover she was a billionaire on the run. The storm came fast, swallowing the small town in darkness. Rain pounded against rooftops, washing the streets under the dim glow of flickering streetlights. It was the kind of night that kept most people inside, safe and warm by their fireplaces. But not Daniel Carter. He was exactly where he always was. His modest auto shop at the town's edge, sleeves rolled up, hands covered in grease, fixing things others had given up on. He was used to the quiet, the solitude, until she arrived. A truck, barely holding itself together, sputtered down the road, struggling with its last breath. Behind the wheel sat a woman, soaked from head to toe, her wide eyes carrying something Daniel couldn't quite place. Fear, desperation, or maybe something more. From the moment she appeared, he knew she didn't belong in this town. And yet, for reasons he couldn't explain, he felt drawn to her. What happens when a man who has given up on love meets a woman running from everything she has ever known? What happens when two very different lives collide in a way neither expected? One storm brought them together, but will love be enough to make her stay? If you're ready for a story of romance, self-discovery, and love that defies all odds, stay with us. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and get comfortable, because The Mechanic and the Millionaire is about to take you on a journey you won't forget. The rain beat down hard against the tin roof of Daniel Carter's small auto repair shop. It was a stormy night, the kind that kept most people indoors. But Daniel was used to nights like this, hands slick with oil and grease, fixing what others had long abandoned. As he wiped his hands on a rag and glanced at the clock, almost midnight, he thought about another long day, another round of repairs he had done for free. People called him a fool for never charging struggling customers, but to Daniel, it was just the right thing to do. He knew what it meant to need a helping hand. Just as he was about to close up, headlights flickered through the rain. An old, beat-up truck crawled toward his shop, barely making it. Then, just as it reached the entrance, the engine sputtered, coughed, and died. Daniel grabbed his flashlight and stepped into the rain. The cold bit through his flannel shirt, but he ignored it as he approached the truck. Inside, a woman sat gripping the wheel, as if sheer willpower could make the vehicle move. When he knocked on the window, she hesitated before rolling it down. She was young, maybe late 20s, wrapped in a rain-soaked jacket. Her brown hair clung to her face, and her uncertain eyes met his. "The truck's dead," she said, her voice barely audible over the storm. Daniel nodded. "Sounds like it. You need help?" She hesitated again, as if deciding whether to trust him. Finally, she nodded. "Yeah, it just stopped." "All right," he said, stepping back. "Pop the hood." She fumbled with the latch, and Daniel lifted the hood, letting his flashlight's beam cut through the darkness. The engine was in rough shape, frayed wires, rusted parts, as if it hadn't been serviced in years. He sighed, running a hand through his damp hair. "You're lucky you made it this far," he muttered. She shifted in her seat. "Can you fix it?" "Not tonight," he admitted, "but I can tow it to my shop and take a look in the morning." A flicker of worry crossed her face. "How much will that cost?" Daniel studied her. Her clothes were simple, worn but clean. Her hands, delicate, uncalloused, told him she wasn't used to hard labor. Something about her didn't quite fit, but he couldn't put his finger on it. "I'll tow it for free," he said. She looked at him, surprised. "Why?" "Because it's the right thing to do." Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to argue, but then she simply nodded. "Thank you." An hour later, The truck was parked safely outside the shop. Daniel handed her a towel and a steaming cup of coffee. "You got a name?" he asked, leaning against the workbench. She hesitated, then nodded. "Mia." "All right, Mia. Where are you from?" She glanced at the rain-splattered window, as if considering her answer. "Nowhere, really. Just passing through." Daniel arched a brow. This town isn't exactly a tourist stop. A faint smile flickered across her lips. "I like quiet places." He studied her again. Something about her was off. Her jacket was too new, her voice too polished. But he didn't press. Everyone had their secrets. "You got a place to stay?" She shook her head. "I was planning to sleep in my truck." Daniel sighed. "Not a good idea in this weather. There's a motel down the road. Not fancy, but dry." She hesitated. "I don't have much money." He exhaled, rubbing his face. "All right. I got a spare cot in the back. It ain't much, but it's better than your truck." She looked at him, searching his face as if trying to read his intentions. "You don't even know me." He shrugged. "Don't need to. Just know you need a place to sleep." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, finally, she nodded. "Thank you, Daniel." He paused. "Did I tell you my name?" She stiffened slightly but quickly covered it with a small smile. "It was on your sign outside." Daniel didn't reply, but something about her answer didn't sit right. Still, he gestured toward the back. "Come on. I'll show you where you can sleep." As she followed him, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just let a mystery walk through his door. Daniel was a man of routine. Mornings started with black coffee and long hours in the garage, the scent of motor oil filling the air, the rhythmic clang of tools against steel his only music. It was a steady, predictable life, one he had built with his own hands. But this morning was different. As he stepped into the shop, stretching his shoulders, his eyes drifted to the cot in the back room. The blankets were neatly folded, the pillow untouched. For a moment he thought Mia had slipped away before sunrise, vanishing into the storm like a ghost. Then he heard it, the faint clatter of dishes from the small kitchenette. He turned the corner and found her standing by the counter, frowning at his ancient coffee maker like it was some kind of puzzle. "You planning to blow up my kitchen?" Daniel asked, leaning against the doorway. Mia jumped, nearly knocking over the coffee pot. She spun around, looking guilty. "Sorry. I just thought I'd make some coffee as a thank you." Daniel smirked. "That thing hasn't worked right in years." She sighed, setting the pot down. "Figures. I'm not exactly great with machines. That much is obvious." She narrowed her eyes at him, but there was amusement behind the glare. Daniel took a slow sip of his own coffee and studied her. In the daylight, she looked different. Less like a lost traveler, more like someone trying hard to disappear. "So," he asked, breaking the silence, "what's your story?" Mia hesitated, wrapping her hands around a mug of tea, one she must have found in his cabinets. "I already told you. I'm just passing through." Daniel arched a brow. "Most people passing through don't drive an old truck held together by duct tape, and they usually know how to work a coffee maker." She gave him a small, almost teasing smile. "Maybe I just like a challenge." He wasn't convinced. There was something off about her, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. But he wasn't the type to pry. People had their reasons for keeping secrets. Lord knew he had enough of his own. Instead of pushing, he gestured toward the garage. "Come on, let's see what we're dealing with under that hood." Mia followed him outside, the morning air crisp and fresh after the storm. The truck was exactly as he remembered, old, battered, and barely functional. Daniel popped the hood and let out a low whistle. Damn, this thing's been running on sheer willpower. Mia peeked over his shoulder, frowning. That bad? He shot her a look. You tell me, when's the last time you got an oil change? She hesitated. A while ago? He sighed. Thought so. Daniel got to work, checking fluids, tightening loose parts, and assessing the damage. He had expected rust and wear, but what surprised him was the sheer neglect. Whoever had owned this truck before her either didn't know or didn't care how to take care of an engine. You really don't know anything about cars, do you? He asked after a while. Mia laughed, and for the first time it sounded genuine. Is it that obvious? Painfully. She leaned against the truck, watching him work. My dad always handled stuff like this. I never had to. Daniel glanced up. It was the first real personal detail she had let slip. That's so? She nodded but didn't elaborate. Daniel didn't push. Instead, he wiped his hands on a rag and stepped back. Well, good news is I can fix it. Bad news is it's going to take some time. Mia looked almost relieved. How long? A couple days at least. Need to order some parts. She bit her lip, as if considering something. Guess I'll have to find a place to stay. Daniel hesitated. He wasn't in the habit of inviting strangers to linger, but something about the way she said it, like she didn't have anywhere else to go, made him rethink. There's a diner down the road, he said instead. They might know someone renting out a room. Mia nodded, but she didn't move right away. She lingered, watching him, as if she wanted to say something else. Finally, she spoke. You're really kind, you know that? Daniel let out a dry chuckle. I'm just a mechanic. She tilted her head slightly. No. You're more than that. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. Compliments weren't something he heard often, especially not from someone like her, someone who clearly came from a different world. Before he could reply, Mia pushed off the truck. I should head out. See if I can find that diner. Daniel nodded, watching as she walked away. There was something about her that didn't add up. And the more he tried to ignore it, the more he found himself wanting to figure out exactly who Mia really was. The morning sun filtered through the open garage doors, casting golden streaks over Daniel's workbench. The scent of motor oil, metal, and fresh coffee filled the air. He had already been up for hours, busying himself with other repairs while waiting for parts to arrive for Mia's truck. He wasn't expecting to see her again so soon. The bell above the garage door chimed as she stepped inside, hesitating for just a second before fully entering. Dressed in jeans and a simple flannel, she looked more like she belonged here than she had the night before, though there was still something just slightly off, like she was playing a role she hadn't quite mastered. Daniel glanced up from under the hood of an old Ford pickup. Didn't expect you back so soon. Mia shrugged. Figured I'd check in and, well, I don't really have anywhere else to be. There it was again, that quiet, unspoken weight behind her words. Daniel wiped his hands on a rag, considering her for a moment. You eat yet? She shook her head. He jerked his head toward the small kitchen in the corner. There's coffee and some leftover biscuits. Not fresh, but better than nothing. Mia smiled, a flicker of amusement in her eyes. You always this hospitable? Nope, he said. Just don't want you passing out in my shop. She laughed, a real, full laugh this time, and it surprised him how much he liked the sound of it. Over the next couple of days, Mia kept coming back. She didn't have a job, and she didn't seem in a hurry to move on. At first, Daniel thought she was just killing time while waiting for her truck to be fixed, but the more they talked, the more he realized she was lingering for a different reason. She was trying to learn. One afternoon, as he tightened the bolts on her truck's engine, she sat on a stool nearby, watching intently. "What are you doing now?" she asked. Daniel exhaled, wiping sweat from his brow. "Checking the timing belt. If this thing snaps, the whole engine could go to hell." Mia frowned. "Engines have belts?" He paused, giving her a look. "You seriously don't know that?" She grinned sheepishly. "I know cars move, I just don't know how." Daniel shook his head, suppressing a smirk. "All right, princess. Lesson 1. "Princess?" she interrupted, raising an eyebrow. He leaned against the truck, arms crossed. "You've got soft hands, no calluses, and judging by the fact that you couldn't even figure out my coffee maker, I'd say you weren't exactly raised fixing things." Mia's expression wavered for just a second, just long enough for Daniel to notice. But then she covered it with a smirk. "So what? You're saying I can't learn?" He studied her for a beat, then handed her a wrench. "Fine. Let's see what you got." She took it, gripping it awkwardly, and Daniel tried not to laugh. "You hold that like you're about to stab someone." Mia rolled her eyes. "Maybe I am." Despite her protests, she listened as he explained the basics. He showed her how to check the oil, how to listen for engine trouble, and even let her change a tire under his supervision. She struggled, but she was determined, and there was something oddly endearing about the way she bit her lip in concentration while trying to twist a stubborn bolt. By the end of the day, her hands were covered in grease. She held them up, looking at them as if they belonged to someone else. "Huh," she said. "I think this is the dirtiest I've ever been." Daniel smirked. "Congratulations, you're officially a mechanic in training." She grinned, wiping her hands on a rag. "I'll put that on my resume." Daniel leaned against the truck, arms crossed. "You know, you don't have to stick around here." Mia hesitated. "Do you want me to leave?" It was an honest question. Daniel considered it for a moment. He had spent most of his life alone, and he had never minded it. But lately, the garage didn't seem as quiet as it used to. "Nah," he admitted. "I don't mind the company." Mia's smile was small but genuine. "Me neither." That night, the air was warm and still, carrying the lingering scent of rain-soaked earth from the storm a few days prior. Mia sat on the tailgate of an old truck parked outside the shop, gazing up at the sky. Daniel leaned against the side of the truck, sipping from a beer bottle. They had settled into a comfortable silence, the kind that didn't need to be filled with words. "You ever think about leaving this town?" Mia asked suddenly. Daniel glanced at her. "Not really." "Why not?" He shrugged. "Got everything I need here. Don't see much reason to go." Mia was quiet for a moment before murmuring, "I envy that." Daniel studied her profile, the way her features softened in the moonlight. "What exactly are you running from?" Mia's fingers tightened around the edge of the truck bed. "Who says I'm running?" Daniel didn't push. He just gave her a knowing look. She sighed, shaking her head. "I don't know. I guess I just needed a change." "From what?" Mia hesitated, then finally met his gaze. "A life that never really felt like mine." Daniel didn't press for details. He figured she'd tell him when she was ready. Instead, he took another sip of his beer and said, "Well, you picked the right place. Ain't much out here, but at least it's quiet." Mia smiled. "Yeah, I think I like that." For the first time in a long while, Daniel realized he didn't mind the quiet either, not when she was there to share it. By the time Daniel arrived at the garage the next morning, the sun was already high. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of fresh dew and motor oil. He had grown used to starting his day alone, but now he half expected to find Mia waiting for him, eager to learn something new about cars. Sure enough, there she was, sitting cross-legged on the hood of her truck, flipping through an old car manual with a look of sheer determination. Daniel smirked as he walked past. Trying to impress me? Mia huffed and set the book down. Trying to understand how this stupid engine works. You make it look easy. That's 'cause I've been doing it my whole life. He grabbed a wrench and nodded toward the truck. Come on, let's see what you remember from yesterday. Mia slid off the hood and took the wrench, looking only slightly more confident than before as she fumbled with the bolts. Daniel watched her closely, not just her hands, but the way she moved, the way she carried herself. Something didn't add up. She was trying, that much was clear, but there was a stiffness to her movements. It wasn't just inexperience. It was like she was entirely unfamiliar with this kind of work. Most people who grew up in small towns or working-class backgrounds at least knew the basics. But Mia? She was starting from zero. And then there were the little things, the way she reacted when grease smeared her shirt, how she hesitated before touching anything too dirty, the way she winced when she bent her nails the wrong way against the wrench. She wasn't used to this life, not even close. You ever worked a day in your life? Daniel asked suddenly, watching for her reaction. Mia stiffened slightly before masking it with a laugh. Wow, thanks for the vote of confidence. I'm serious, he pressed. You don't strike me as someone who spent much time fixing things. She hesitated, then shrugged. I've had jobs. What kind? She wiped her hands on a rag, avoiding his gaze. You ask a lot of questions, you know that? Daniel leaned against the truck, arms crossed. Only when things don't add up. Mia looked at him then, her expression unreadable. For a moment, it seemed like she might tell him something real. But just as quickly, she forced a grin. Maybe I just lived a sheltered life. Daniel didn't buy it, but he let it go. Later that afternoon, while waiting for a shipment of parts, Daniel sat at his desk, sipping coffee and sorting through invoices. Mia had wandered off to grab something from the diner down the road. It was the first time in days she had left the shop on her own. He should have gone back to work. He should have ignored the nagging feeling in his gut. But instead, his eyes drifted toward the small bench where Mia had left her things. That's when he saw it. Her phone, lying face up on the table, the screen still glowing. Daniel wasn't the kind of man to snoop, but when he caught a glimpse of the message that had just come in, his stomach tightened. Unknown number. Mia, where are you? This isn't a game. The board is asking questions. His jaw clenched. The board? What the hell did that mean? Before he could think too much about it, another message popped up. Unknown. Number. Your shares are still active. If you don't come back soon, they'll make the decision for you. Daniel stared at the phone, his mind racing. Shares? The board? Mia wasn't just some runaway looking for a quiet life. She was hiding something big. By the time Mia returned, Daniel had forced himself to act normal. He didn't mention the messages. He didn't ask questions, but he watched her more closely. That evening, as they worked on her truck together, he decided to test his theory. So, you said you grew up in a small town? He asked casually. Mia nodded. Yeah, farm girl. She hesitated for just a second before nodding again. Daniel smirked. All right then. What's the best way to milk a cow? Mia blinked. What? Simple question, he said, leaning against the truck. You grew up around farms, right? You should know how to milk a cow. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Well, you just grab and squeeze? Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. Yeah, that's one way to piss off a cow. Mia groaned, rubbing her temples. Okay, fine. I didn't exactly grow up on a farm, maybe just near one. Uh-huh. She shot him a look. What is this, an interrogation? Just making conversation. Mia sighed, crossing her arms. All right, your turn. You ever left this town? Daniel shrugged. No reason to? No curiosity about the world out there? Not really. She studied him for a long moment, then shook her head with a small smile. You're a rare kind of person, Daniel. Yeah. She hesitated, then added softly, I think I envy that. For the first time all day, Daniel saw something real in her eyes, something raw and unguarded, and for a moment, he almost forgot about the messages on her phone. Almost. The next day, Mia showed up at the garage like she had all week, walking in with her usual easy smile and 2 cups of coffee from the diner down the road. Figured I owed you one, she said, handing him a cup. Daniel took it, studying her carefully. You don't owe me anything. She gave him a playful look. Come on, just take the coffee. No hidden motives, I promise. He didn't respond right away, just took a sip and let the silence stretch between them. Mia tilted her head. You okay? You seem quiet. He hesitated, then shook his head. Just thinking. Careful, she teased. That's a dangerous habit. That made him smirk, briefly. His mind was still turning, trying to piece things together. The messages, the way she dodged questions, how she clearly had never worked with her hands a day in her life, despite what she claimed. Mia wasn't just a drifter. She was someone who had never struggled, until now. And as if the universe wanted to confirm his suspicions, the final piece of the puzzle landed in his lap that very afternoon. It started with a delivery. Daniel had ordered parts for Mia's truck, and while signing off on the invoice, the delivery guy, Joe, an older man who had been coming through town for years, paused, squinting toward the garage. Huh, Joe muttered, scratching his beard. Didn't expect to see her in a place like this. Daniel looked up. What do you mean? Joe nodded toward Mia, who was in the back, pretending to organize tools she barely knew how to use. That girl, Joe said, lowering his voice. Swear I've seen her face before. Daniel felt his chest tighten. Where? Joe frowned, thinking, then pulled out his phone, tapped a few times, and turned the screen toward him. Daniel's stomach dropped. It was a business magazine, the kind he had never paid much attention to. But right there, front and center, was a glossy photo of Mia. Except she wasn't the girl who had walked into his garage days ago. She was polished, poised, standing in front of a massive skyscraper, dressed in a crisp blazer. And the headline? Daniel barely heard Joe chuckle. Yeah, she's some rich girl from New York, right? Supposed to take over some big company, but then she up and disappeared. Lot of people wondering where she went. Joe shook his head. Guess now I know. Daniel's grip tightened around the phone. Mia wasn't just running. She was running from an entire life she had never told him about. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniel sat on the hood of his truck, waiting. Mia had gone for a walk earlier, and when she finally returned, she looked exhausted, like she had spent the whole day carrying a weight too heavy for her shoulders. She spotted him and slowed, her expression cautious. You okay? Daniel exhaled, running a hand through his hair. You ever gonna tell me the truth? Mia froze. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, slowly, she sat beside him on the truck, staring at her hands. What do you want to know? She asked quietly. Daniel turned to her, voice steady. I know who you are, Mia. She flinched, but he kept going. You're not just some girl passing through town. You're Mia Davenport. He watched her, waiting for her to deny it, but she didn't. Instead, she let out a long, shaky breath. Yeah, she whispered. I am. Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. So why are you here? Mia hesitated, then met his gaze. Because I didn't want to be here anymore. Daniel hadn't expected that. He had braced himself for excuses, for half-truths. But not this. Not raw honesty. Mia looked down at her hands again, voice barely above a whisper. I grew up in a world where everything was controlled. Who I was, what I did, who I was supposed to become. I was never allowed to make my own choices. So I left. Daniel studied her carefully. Just like that? She let out a bitter laugh. Not exactly. I walked away from billions, Daniel. From a life most people would kill for, and for what? A broken-down truck and a town where no one knows my name. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Sounds like freedom. Mia blinked. What? He shrugged. You said you wanted to make your own choices. Looks like you did. She stared at him, unreadable. Then, slowly, she smiled, and for the first time, Daniel realized something. He didn't care where she came from. He just cared that she was here. Daniel had always believed in honesty. It was a simple principle, one that guided the way he worked, the way he lived. And yet, now that Mia had finally told him the truth, he wasn't sure what to do with it. She was Mia Davenport, heiress to a corporate empire, a woman whose face had been printed in business magazines, whose name carried weight in boardrooms he would never step foot in. And she had been lying to him from the start. The weight of it sat heavy between them as they remained on the truck's hood, the night air thick with unspoken words. Finally, Daniel exhaled. So what now? Mia glanced at him, fingers twisting together. What do you mean? He shook his head. You really think you can just stay here forever? That the world you left behind won't come looking for you? Mia looked away, jaw tightening. I don't know. She swallowed hard. I just wanted a chance to be me for once. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. And what does that even mean, Mia? Who are you? For a second, he thought she might deflect, might throw up one of her usual walls. But then her shoulders sagged. I don't know, she admitted. She let out a slow breath. I grew up in boardrooms, surrounded by expectations. My father groomed me to take over the company before I even knew what I wanted. Every move I made was calculated, every decision controlled. Then he died, and suddenly the entire empire was in my hands. And I realized, she swallowed, I had never lived my own life. She shook her head, laughing bitterly. So I left. I walked away from billions, from a life people dream of, because it never felt real to me. Daniel let her words settle, then said, Must be nice. Mia's head snapped up, brow furrowing. What? Having the luxury to just walk away. Her lips parted slightly, like she had expected sympathy, and was caught off guard when she didn't get it. Daniel leaned forward, voice steady, but firm. You say you never got to make your own choices, but you did get to choose to leave. Not everyone gets that option. Mia's expression wavered, guilt flickering across her face. I'm not saying your life was easy, he continued, his tone softer now. But out here, in this town, people don't get to run away from their problems. They've got mortgages, families to feed, no safety net. You had one, whether you wanted it or not. Mia looked down, fingers tightening against the hem of her shirt. I know, she murmured. And then, even softer, like she was afraid to admit it. And that's what scares me the most. Mia had always imagined that returning to the world she had left behind would feel suffocating, that the moment she stepped back into the towering glass walls of corporate life, she'd lose the small piece of freedom she had stolen for herself. And in many ways, she had been right. The moment she walked through the revolving doors of Davenport Industries, the weight of expectation settled back onto her shoulders like an old, familiar coat. The receptionist had barely looked up before recognizing her, eyes widening as she fumbled to alert the necessary people. Within minutes, a dozen voices swirled around her, executives, assistants, board members, all speaking at once, each one eager to know what had brought her back. She kept her answers vague, brushing off their questions with a polite but firm smile. The truth was, she wasn't even sure why she had come back. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was inevitability, or maybe, just maybe, it was because running had never been a long-term solution. Her mother was waiting for her in the corner office on the top floor, standing with her arms crossed, her sharp gaze scanning Mia from head to toe. "You finally decided to come back," her mother said, voice crisp, unreadable. Mia exhaled. "I don't know if I'm back," she admitted. "I just needed to—" She hesitated because she didn't actually know how to finish that sentence. Her mother pursed her lips, stepping forward. "Mia, you were born for this. I know you think you needed to leave, but this company, this life, it's where you belong." The words made Mia's stomach twist. Belong. Daniel had said the same thing, but in a completely different way. He had spoken as if she had no choice, as if fate had already sealed her path. And now, here she was, back in a world that had never truly felt like her own. She wasn't sure what she had expected when she left that small town. Maybe she had hoped for clarity, for the distance to make things easier. But all she felt now was the gnawing realization that she had left something behind. Or rather, someone. Daniel. She could still hear his voice, low and steady, calling her out on her privilege, on the ability to run when others had no choice. She had wanted to be angry with him, to tell him he didn't understand. But he had. He had seen through her better than anyone ever had. And she had walked away. Her mother was still speaking, something about upcoming board meetings and stockholder expectations, but Mia wasn't listening anymore. She had made a mistake, a big one. Before she could overthink it, she turned on her heel. "I have to go," she said, already heading toward the door. Her mother's voice followed her, sharp with disapproval. "Mia, where do you think you're going?" Mia glanced over her shoulder, a slow smile spreading across her lips. "To make my own choice." Daniel had been driving for hours with no real destination, only a gut feeling that told him to keep going. He had no clue if he'd actually find her, or if she even wanted to be found. But that letter, it had said everything she couldn't say out loud. And if there was even a chance that she meant it, that she had wanted him to follow, then he wasn't going to waste any more time. His phone buzzed on the seat beside him, and he almost ignored it until he saw the name on the screen. Mia. His heart slammed against his ribs as he reached for the phone, gripping it tightly before answering. "Mia?" There was a pause on the other end, then a soft laugh, shaky, unsure, but real. "Hey, Daniel." He swallowed hard. "Where are you?" Another pause. "I'm not sure," she admitted, "but I think I'm on my way back." Daniel exhaled slowly, his grip on the wheel tightening. He didn't know what would happen next, if this was another temporary stop for her, or if she was finally ready to stay. But he knew one thing for sure. He was going to find out. The moment Mia stepped back into New York, it was as if she had never left. The doorman greeted her like always. Her long-abandoned assistant rushed to reorganize her schedule, and the board members, who had been circling like vultures in her absence, barely looked surprised to see her walk into the meeting room. It was as if they had known all along that she would come back. Her life had been waiting for her, unchanged, exactly where she had left it. So why did it feel so empty? 3 weeks had passed since she left the small town. 3 weeks since she had walked away from Daniel. She told herself it was for the best. Daniel had been right. This was her world, whether she liked it or not. There was no escaping it. No matter how far she ran, it would always pull her back. But that didn't stop her from missing him. She missed the little things, the scent of motor oil clinging to his shirt, the way he called her princess just to get a rise out of her, the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her like she was more than just a name in a magazine. She missed how her hands had gotten dirty working on cars, how the town had felt like home in a way New York never had. But most of all, she missed the feeling of belonging, one that had nothing to do with boardrooms or corporate legacies. She had tried to bury it, dived headfirst into work, attended endless meetings, sat in polished boardrooms where decisions worth millions were made with a flick of a pen. But every time she looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows of her penthouse office, her mind wandered to a garage in the middle of nowhere, and to a man she had left behind. One restless night, unable to sleep, Mia found herself scrolling through news articles, catching up on the business world she had been away from. And then she saw it. A small feature buried beneath headlines of market trends and corporate takeovers. A new program aimed at funding small-town businesses. Right in the center of the page was a picture of Daniel's garage. Mia's breath hitched as she skimmed the article. The initiative was designed to support struggling repair shops in rural areas, businesses like Daniel's, the kind that kept communities running but rarely had the financial backing to expand. And the person funding it? Her. She had signed off on it without a second thought, buried under a mountain of paperwork. At the time, it had been just another way to make use of the wealth she barely cared about. But now, seeing his garage on the screen, knowing she had helped him, even from a distance, made her realize something. She could lie to herself all she wanted, tell herself she belonged here, in this world of suits and contracts, but her heart had never left, and maybe it never would. The next morning, Mia walked into the boardroom, took her usual seat at the head of the polished conference table, and made a decision. I'm stepping down. Silence. For a moment, no one spoke. No one even breathed. Then, one of the senior board members, a man who had worked for her father for years, adjusted his tie and cleared his throat. Excuse me? Mia exhaled, steadying herself. You heard me. I'm stepping down as CEO, effective immediately. Another board member, a woman known for her cutthroat business tactics, leaned forward, her expression unreadable. You just got back. This company needs you. No, Mia said simply, shaking her head. It doesn't. And for the first time in her life, she meant it. She had spent years believing she had no choice, that she had to be the person her father had molded her to be. But that wasn't true. Daniel had shown her that. And now she was finally ready to live life on her own terms. That night, as she packed a single suitcase, Mia felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. She had no idea what would happen next. No idea if Daniel would even want to see her again. But she did know one thing. She was going back, and this time she wasn't running away. She was running home. Daniel had spent his whole life fixing broken things, engines worn down to their last mile, transmissions that should have been junked years ago, cars barely holding themselves together. But some things couldn't be fixed with a wrench. He had tried to move on after Mia left, convinced himself it didn't matter. She had been temporary, just another visitor passing through town. But every time he stepped into the garage, the silence felt heavier. Every time he picked up a tool, he remembered her fumbling to fix her own truck, stubbornly refusing to quit. Every time he lay awake at night, he saw the way she had looked at him before she left, like she had wanted him to stop her, but knew he never would. It had taken him too long to realize the truth. He had let her go because he thought it was the right thing to do. But now, he wasn't so sure. It started with the letter, the one she had left behind, the one he had ignored for days, too afraid to face what it meant. But once he finally read it, there was no going back. Mia had wanted him to come after her. She hadn't said it outright, but he saw it in her words, in the way she had written, "I don't expect you to follow me," like she had been daring him to prove her wrong. And damn it, he was going to. For the first time in years, Daniel locked up the garage, threw his bag into the truck, and drove out of town without a second thought. He didn't have an address, didn't even know if she would still be there when he arrived. But it didn't matter, because now he understood something. Mia hadn't been the only one running. He had been running too, running from the truth, running from what she meant to him, running from the terrifying realization that he needed her in a way that shook him to his core. But he wasn't afraid anymore. New York was a world away from everything he knew, the noise, the people, the relentless pace. But none of it mattered, because he wasn't here for the city. He was here for her, and he had no intention of leaving without her. It took him hours to find her office, longer still to figure out how to get inside without getting tossed out by security. By the time he stepped into the gleaming lobby, dust from the road clung to his boots, leaving footprints on the polished marble floor. People stared. He didn't care. He was only looking for one person. The receptionist glanced up, startled at the sight of a man who looked like he belonged in a garage, not a skyscraper. "Sir, can I help?" "I'm here for Mia Davenport," Daniel said, his voice steady. The receptionist hesitated. "Do you have an appointment?" Daniel exhaled sharply. "But I'm not leaving until I see her." Before she could respond, a voice rang out from the staircase. "Daniel?" He turned. And there she was. Mia stood at the top of the marble steps, staring at him like he was the last person in the world she had expected to see. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Daniel stepped forward. "I don't care how much money you have," he said, loud enough for the entire lobby to hear. "I don't care what world you come from or what world you think you belong to." Mia's breath caught. Daniel's gaze never wavered. "All I care about is whether you're happy," he said. "And if you're not, then I want to fix that." Mia's fingers tightened around the railing, because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid to believe him. People were watching now. Whispers spread through the lobby as businessmen and assistants paused to witness the scene unfolding before them. But Daniel didn't care. He had spent his whole life keeping his emotions in check, guarding himself from heartbreak. Not this time. He took another step closer. "I let you walk away once, Mia," he said, his voice softening. "I'm not making that mistake again." Mia's eyes glistened, her lips parting slightly as if she wanted to say something. Then suddenly, she was moving. Before Daniel could react, she was running down the stairs, past the onlookers, straight into his arms. He caught her without hesitation, wrapping her tightly against him as she buried her face into his chest. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in a muffled voice, she whispered, "You idiot." Daniel let out a breathless chuckle, pressing his chin against her hair. "Yeah, took me long enough to figure that out." She pulled back just enough to look at him. "You came for me." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Yeah," he murmured. "And I'm not going anywhere, unless you come with me." Mia stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she smiled. And in that moment, Daniel knew He had finally found something he wasn't afraid to fight for. The road stretched ahead, golden fields rolling past under the soft glow of the setting sun. The wind rushed through the open truck windows, carrying the scent of earth and wildflowers. Mia sat in the passenger seat, absent-mindedly tracing patterns on the worn leather of the dashboard. For the first time in forever, she wasn't running. She was going home. Daniel glanced over at her, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "You sure you're ready for small-town life again? No high-rises, no fancy boardrooms, no corporate deals?" Mia turned to face him, her expression soft. "I never really belonged in those places, Daniel. Not really." He raised an eyebrow. "And you think you belong in a garage with a grumpy mechanic?" Mia smiled and reached over, taking his hand. "I think I belong with you." Daniel exhaled slowly, squeezing her hand before bringing it to his lips. He wasn't a man of flowery words or grand gestures, but he didn't need them, not with her. By the time they reached town, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting a warm, dusky glow over the streets. The town square was quiet, settling in for the night, but as they pulled up to the garage, something unexpected awaited them. Lights. Strings of warm bulbs were strung across the entrance, glowing softly in the dark. A small crowd had gathered, familiar faces from Daniel's world. Mrs. Thompson from the bakery stood at the front, hands on her hips. Joe, the old delivery driver, leaned against his truck, grinning. Even the sheriff was there, nodding approvingly. Mia blinked. "What is this?" Daniel looked just as confused. "Beats me." As they stepped out of the truck, Mrs. Thompson approached, a twinkle in her eye. "Took you long enough to bring her back." Mia laughed, shaking her head. "You knew I was coming?" The older woman shrugged. "Daniel might be stubborn, but he's not a fool. We had a feeling he wouldn't let you get away that easily." Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "Jesus. Do you people have nothing better to do than gossip about my love life?" Joe chuckled. "Not when it's this interesting." Mia turned to Daniel, her heart swelling. These people, this place, they had welcomed her in ways she had never expected. And now, it was home. A week later, the garage officially reopened. But it wasn't just a garage anymore. With Mia's help, they expanded it into something more. A place that not only fixed cars, but also offered free services to those who couldn't afford repairs. A space where people could gather, where kids could learn the trade, where no one was ever turned away. And right next door, something entirely new. A cafe. Mia's idea. She had wanted to build something of her own, small but meaningful. Where there had once been an empty lot, there was now a cozy little coffee shop filled with the scent of fresh pastries and the sound of laughter. It was the perfect blend of both their worlds, Daniel's hands-on craftsmanship and Mia's warmth and vision. And together, it worked. One evening, as the sky turned shades of pink and gold, Mia stood outside the cafe, wiping down the last of the outdoor tables. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Daniel approaching, his hands in his pockets. He stopped in front of her, studying her for a moment. Then, without a word, he pulled something from his pocket and held it out. A small, worn key. Mia frowned. "What's this?" Daniel smirked. "Key to the garage." She blinked. "I thought I already had one." "You do." He hesitated, then added, "But this one's different." She tilted her head, waiting. Daniel exhaled, rubbing his jaw. "You left once, and I know you're not the type to be tied down. But if you ever feel like running again..." He pressed the key into her palm. "Just remember, you always have a home here." Mia stared at him, her throat tightening. She had spent so much of her life feeling like she had to choose between expectation and freedom, between the past and the future. But now she realized she didn't have to run anymore, because she had already found what she was looking for. She stepped forward, wrapping her arms around his neck, pulling him into a kiss that tasted like promises kept and a future waiting to be lived. And when they pulled apart, she whispered, "I'm exactly where I want to be." Daniel smiled, brushing his thumb over her cheek. "Good, because I don't plan on letting you go again." The world was quiet around them, the stars just beginning to appear in the vast stretch of sky above. And as they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, in a town where love was built on patience and second chances, Mia knew this was home, and it always would be. And that, my friends, is the story of the mechanic and the millionaire, a journey of love, second chances, and finding where you truly belong. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? A quiet small town like Daniel's or a big bustling city like the one Mia left behind? Drop your location in the comments. I'd love to see how far this story has traveled. What did you think of the ending? Did it leave you with that warm, satisfying feeling of a perfect love story? Or do you wish there was more? Let's talk about it in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button. And if you love stories that touch the heart, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another one. There's so much more coming your way. Thank you for watching, for being part of this journey, and for sharing your time with me. Your support means the world, and I can't wait to bring you more stories that stay with you long after the last word is spoken. Until next time, stay inspired, stay kind, and keep believing in love. Subscribe now, and I'll see you in the next one.